Hello everyone, today we respond to yet another scholagladiatoria's video. At this point, that is August the 15th, as I'm recording. Scholagladiatoria's last video titled Why Did Bills Beat Pikes at the Battle of Flodden 1513? And some of you were saying, oh, Schwerpunkt, you're getting repetitive, you're going at scholagladiatoria. No, everybody watching my videos knows that these videos are not to sort of smear or to antagonize with scholagladiatoria. Actually, this video is pretty interesting, and as always, Matt Easton leaves this open question. What do you think about this? Should we think about this battle in this case more? What was the role of this and that? And I actually largely, for most videos, I largely agree with the insights offered by the creator of the same concept of HEMA, as a matter of fact. So, as always in these videos, as a disclaimer, I say that I greatly admire Matt Easton's work, and I think that he's generally an overall positive force out there. Here and there, I disagree. Also, very importantly, with certain ideas, especially revolving around sort of the like in this video in part, the sort of overall interest in type of arms and how they were employed. Also, and this is why this video is more interesting also than others that I made responding to him, because it goes towards not just a greater scale, like formation, a collective tactics, a discussion as far as these weapons are concerned, but it talks about an actual battle. In fact, this video is going to be slightly different from the other ones where we read his script and we comment on it. We'll be partially doing this to show you essentially how I agree with, say, 90% of what is said. Naturally, I'll spend more time criticizing what I disagree with than reading the script. Obviously, his videos are also fairly short, at least. This was longer, as we'll see now. But at the end of this video, I'm going to do something very similar to what we do with our battle reconstructions video, except this is not a video about the Battle of Flodden per se. It can be the base for a future video about the Battle of Flodden, because there is really a lot of very interesting political, strategic context to which scholagladiatoria also alludes. And so I'm not going to make all the possible inquiry on the general circumstances, but I would like to point out, especially at the end of the video, a very interesting quote. I never presumed Easton to watch my videos, as a matter of fact. I make these videos in part, yes, it's also for the views, because normally these videos for some reason make more views. People are intrigued because I respond to a YouTuber, but I've never done this with my mindset, say, okay, now I hope he's answering me, or I want him to answer, whatever. But there is, at the end of the video, a very specific quote from that probably also knows, who's surely read at some point, about the Battle of Flodden that I think is interesting as far as one of the points that he's making, that he is also asking himself about, right? So it's a bit of a hybrid video. It's probably going to be long, you know in advance, as you have seen it uploaded. I don't know at the moment in which I'm recording, but there is a lot to say. So I'll be paraphrasing what he says so that we can pass to the battle, because again, there are very few parts of this in which I disagree, right? So Easton starts talking about the pike, right? So the introduction of the Battle of Flodden, and the introduction here at least presents with this is little disclaimer of the video what it is, and there is this provoking question that is also always point with a question mark throughout the whole video. So it's not really a statement. It says, what if I told you that there was one weapon which absolutely trounced the pike, right? You see, also in this head, why did Bills beat pikes at the Battle of Flodden? A little bit of clickbait or sensationalism. You can't really blame scholagladiatoria for that, but it's, in fact, it's a thoughtful video of his. Now we'll look at. So it says, in 1513, the pike was destroyed by the English bill. So why and how did the English bill destroy the pikes of the Scots? So, of course, my opinion, as you're probably aware of, is also not just scientific but philosophical in nature. Of course, if we want to claim that a weapon defeated another, like it's more like saying, I don't know, associating countries to their stereotypical food or something like that. Obviously, Easton does know, as he shows evidently in the video, that this is not exactly or technically what happened, and he always puts a question mark behind this. But also the phraseology, of course, induces you to think, because there is not much of a redeeming part in the video, which eventually there is a counter argument to that, and probably this goes beyond the scope of his video itself. And I would suggest that, in fact, this is not a battle. Also because this would be truly the only battle in history, if that were the case, and as we'll see now, it's really not, in which the bill defeated the pike as such. Like, just definitionally speaking, that's not what really happened. And as we'll see now, it's not just about saying, okay, it's not about arms, it's not about weapons per se. It's something more complex. This video offers, in fact, us the sort of the harder way through to point out, to demonstrate. So he remembers here the video that he made about the Roman shields versus Macedonian pikes that I staunchly disagreed with in a broader sense, at least one-to-one, yes, but in more technical terms, there were some implications that I didn't like. You can't watch that video, it's in the topics comment down below. In any case, it says we're going to revisit that topic in a future video. This is very interesting because I'm surely going to respond to that. It says, but for now, we're going to look at pikes in a different era, that is the 16th century, particularly the Battle of Flodden. And why? By the way, as a Schwerpunkt, I'm not going to give any extra context to the Battle of Flodden. We will essentially look at the tactical dynamics, because that's what Easton is reasoning on, specifically when talking about this confrontation between the bill and the pike, right? So he says, and why is that the English bills were able to defeat the pikes of the Scots? So in case you have never heard of the battle, okay, so let's skip. He speaks of the old alliance and makes a first statement that rose my suspicion. You have sort of, because these videos catch your attention, this is weird, like YouTube is weird, the way as quote-unquote creators, terrible name that YouTube attributes as, of course, want to make a point, but the audience does not often quite stop thinking about the specific question. Whenever, for example, I didn't want to answer this video, I watched it a day ago and said, okay, well, that's basically fine. And I got curious about the battle because I also had to check some things to be 100% sure. And as I was rereading the script, I said, you know, here there are some things that help me understand better where he's coming from with this. And he makes this statement, says, in the specific case, the Scots were actually quite a freshly and very professionally and very well-equipped army, right? So, as we will see now, generally speaking, this is the golden rule. When there are these major engagements, here we're talking about, this is a really big battle, at least a few tens of thousands of men per side. The bigger the battle, the more balanced the odds in general. In fact, there is a greater question at the end that, in my opinion, could be answered just statistically like that, but I'm being cryptic, but you understand why. What does it mean exactly that the Scots here were, in any case, very, very professional, very well equipped? Well, probably not much, in the sense that here, I think, and I don't want to be wrong about this, but this is, I've been rereading this a couple of times today, and that's what the video seems to start with as an assumption, that the Scots were here somehow more upgraded than the English for some reason. Why? Because they were using, in part, some professionally drilled, let's say Swiss modeled pikemen, right? That the French had indeed sent to them, had helped to train in part, and so were some sort of mercenaries, or as later the Tudors would normally hire, I don't know, German pikemen, because in England, as also Easton points out, like things lagged behind as far as terrestrial warfare was concerned, right? So here, it's a very powerful statement, because I would say the opposite is true, is that it doesn't matter how, and I think this battle actually shows it doesn't matter how the French may have helped boost up a little bit Scottish tactical quality, which is by itself, yes, of course, you're going to invest in your ally in this war against the English. But say, doesn't speak of, okay, the Scots do not need help of some sort. And actually, the English were historically a more developed force. There is no doubt, again, that they were lagging behind compared to the continent. But you can't say that the Scots, it doesn't matter how much of a fully fledged feudal monarchy were at this point, and definitely might to be reckoned with within Britain, still they weren't really the top level of military development at the time. And this entwines with specific arguments that eventually are made in the rest of the video, all right? But I think that it really sort of sets the ground for this, as he explains now, with this introduction of Swiss model pikemen for just actually a minority of the whole force. That right? This is not stated in the video, I will add it myself, was actually from the Scottish side 80 to 90% levy militias, right? And this will play an important role, not just because, of course, you can't have very strong pike armies based on the Renaissance model, not the model of Bannockburn. That is a different thing. If you watch me, you know that I talk about this stuff all the time. So I will not digress further because I don't want these videos to be too long or boring. But I made tons of videos about this stuff. So if you disagree or if you want to check that out, please don't ask. Just know that there is already all explained out there. I also made a video about the Battle of Stirling Bridge that you can find plenty of this stuff. So it is true that the Scots went at war, of course, with practically all their armies almost completely made of pikemen. There were here small contingents, especially compared to the tens of thousands. We're talking a handful of hundreds, for example, of arquebusiers. The Scots had also impressive artillery train, whatever, but the army as a whole was historically these level militias of pikemen. Right? We've seen them, again, in action in the famous battles of the wars of Scottish independence, so-called. And the Scots had not really changed much the nature of their army. Besides, you can find it also in the top fix comment down below. I made an entire military historical unit. It's actually also army organization video because that's how I make for early modern warfare, Renaissance warfare, exactly about the Scottish lowland pikemen, right, from the late 15th century to the mid-17th. So if you're interested in that specific type of equipment, how they looked like, which is a point that Easton comments on, you can check in that video out. And so he makes the case, he literally says, they weren't, the Scots, the underdog at all in this case. Weren't they? Okay, well, they had a massive army, yeah, that doesn't make them the underdogs in a sense, but were they actually sort of the finest? Here it's not expressed really, but of course they were more than the English, as we'll see now, but they were essentially a more upgraded or effective military system. This is not quite the case that we're aware of. He says they were very well equipped and they'd been equipped by the French with a whole load of new equipment. He says that the King of France had imported thousands of these newfangled pike things into Scotland to assist his ally King James IV in his invasion of England. Not only pikes, incidentally, we'll come back to pikes in a second, but also field artillery, handheld guns, arquebuses, probably armor, a whole load of ordnance, essentially a whole load of equipment. So it was essentially a French armed, equipped and financed army manned by Scots invading England. So yeah, this is not exactly true. Right, this was a Scottish army in almost all its component, and there were some French drilled Swiss model pikemen of the most, in fact, updated continental, especially pike. Wasn't much of a shot. In fact, interestingly enough, this is something we'll see later that probably doesn't depose in favor of the Scots. Had never really fully developed the same amounts of for example, of missile capacity that the English had. Indeed, that the Scots had historically strong longbow, and we'll see that they're present in action, but say sources do not tell us that there was much coming from the Scots, if not the ultimately consequence-less artillery fire. These pikemen were 6,000. As we'll see now, some were actual Scots that had been trained in a also fairly short amount of time, that fashion. Some people say, okay, well, so these were just levies that were not good. Actually, as we'll see now, and this was something that the Scots already had during the Middle Ages, maintained that many of the men-at-arms, many of the knights proper, had historically fought dismounted with pikes in hand, which is exactly how the same James IV of Scotland will die. Yes, the King of Scotland died, for those who don't know, in the front line of formation, fighting as a pikeman. Right, the rest, the overwhelming majority of the Scottish army, it just wasn't sort of updated or particularly sort of innovative or in arms, in organization, whatever. It was a typical Scottish force. It could have found also in the previous generations, pretty much in the same way. All right. Easton says, and indeed the pike was a relatively new weapon. Well, he doesn't mean the pike because he knows that, you know, in the Middle Ages, pikes had always been there. It was the only way to stop cavalry charges in the front ranks. But I mean, he's talking about the Renaissance type of pike drill, which is another story. It says, to make it a long story short, so the pike and the use of the pike coordinated with firearms, so pike and shot both field artillery and handheld guns, was the new form of warfare, right? Let's go on. So you might hear 16th century warfare described as the era of pike and shot because, of course, the use of pikemen used offensively and defensively. We'll come to that in a second. But defensively, they could protect the people reloading their guns, whether it's artillery or whether it's handheld guns, from things like cavalry charges or indeed infantry charges. All right. In one of the videos that I criticized, he went as far as saying that basically the pike developed mostly to protect those guys, whereas it was instead very central and not much just sort of a very novel thing, just as a type of weapon, as we know, in large quantities on the battlefield. He says then, so they could protect the firearms effectively when they reloaded. The pikes were good in defensive formation, but they were also used offensively, even to charge with some extent. And this is actually what the Swiss model was about, right? So this is what also the French were trying to drill the Scots like. In fact, the Battle of Flodden, as we'll see now, the Scots do advance. And this is the greatest change in the history of medieval warfare. Troops were naturally capable of advancing as pikemen, but they, for centuries, they had essentially up to the mid-15th century, could only confront cavalry in defense, whereas the Swiss start with their columns to go, also to gamble massively, because they weren't actually the strongest in absolute terms, but with a type of maneuvering that other type of infantry up to that point, for different political, social reasons, had not developed. And at this point, the great powers of Europe are actually starting to, in fact, also the Swiss will get the hell out of the way relatively quickly, because they did not fully integrate a pike and shot system in sort of dynamic enough quantity to beat, say, the Spanish, the other Germans. The French will integrate Swiss infantry, but within a fully fledged army with their own incredibly powerful cavalry and artillery. And in the sense, the Swiss also fight for the most aristocratic and feudal country was out there, right? And Easton says, in fact, the Swiss have made extensive use of these pikes like this, and so did the Scots. So here I don't actually know whether Easton is referring to the new Renaissance type of warfare, which would be basically wrong in the sense that we can't be blinded by the idea, of course, that, okay, these were pikes, so basically we see Scots with pikes at the beginning of the 16th century. That's basically the Swiss model, right? And not quite. In this case, yes, the French have sent some of their instructors, they have drilled some of the Scots, right, like that. But most of the Scottish army wasn't drilled that fashion, right? And so that's mostly the difference. And there wasn't properly a culture in Scotland yet where this sort of Swiss, the square force pike armies, etc., would simply flourish or develop yet. Also, like, they cost an incredible lot. Not even the English for a long time sort of develop some competitive armies based on the, you can't imagine the Scots, right? So this is not sort of to belittle them, because actually here they do feel a pretty impressive host, but mostly in terms of numbers, not in quality, even less in sort of a whole Renaissance or Reformed fashion, right? So I don't know whether Easton intended, again, the fact that they still had largely pike-based armies for all reasons that we described for other videos. But this is the point. And Easton says, but merry old England under Henry VIII was a little bit behind the times. And so here, again, when you listen to the videos, sometimes there is, of course, intonation, there is different kinds of switching from a concept to another. You may never fully understand whether here, for example, Easton intends literally like England was behind, even the Scots in this sense. This wasn't the case. This really wasn't the case. And Easton says, I'm actually part Scottish, but the English, that was very nice. As an interjection says, let's say we're still using bills and various other forms of short polearm. I made videos about early Tudor infantry in particular. You will find that in the top 5th comment down below. At this point, English infantry did consist of mostly billmen and bowmen, as largely, aside from the men-at-arms, there were something a bit heavier and equipped also with somehow different weapons, were the numerical bulk of English infantry, just as at Flodden. Easton says, now it has to be said, of course, so were the Scots, were the French, so were the German states, the Italians, and everyone else in conjunction with pikes, but pikes had become the predominant equipment for most of the infantry who weren't using some sort of firearm by this point, but England was a bit behind. So, okay, this is, say, tendentially true for major field armies in continental Europe, but when you look at the Scots, a bit less, all right? So there wasn't properly even the social capacity, like the financial premises for Scotland to field armies, like at this point of allegedly 40,000 men, all drilled the Swiss fashion. They were essentially levy militia, essentially the old feudal levies of Scotland of old, right? That was a much sort of more backward system than the English one in a broader sense. I mean, these armies did actually look like one another, and it is true that the English did maintain some pike units. In fact, Easton says maybe a little bit, but not very much. This is absolutely correct. I have no problem with that. But again, that this would contrast fundamentally also with the Scots. It's not, as you understand here, very explicitated, but it sets the premise for claiming that BILLS eventually beat pikes. Naturally, this is still consistent with the title because it's on us now to demonstrate that it's not like BILLS beat pikes, but the English army beat the Scottish one. It's rather claiming that the Scottish model was here something more innovative, perhaps, or that contrasts more with the fact that the English were somehow more backwards, more traditional, however you want to call it, in these tactical developments of pike formations, but it's to contrast more the outcome of the battle eventually. He says that's a little bit later, but at this point in 1513, pretty much only the bill was the primary equipment of the infantry, and of course the longbow, and this is the other way in which the English were quite backward, because while the English had adopted firearms and held artillery, they were still using archers, longbow, archers en masse. Well, I would say this as Schwerpunkt, that while this is true that they did, until the mid-16th century, the longbow was not so outdated. It was still overall adequate in the general sort of European warfare environment. The English did fight on the continent, right, against the French, together with the Imperials, and so on. Easton says so much that even as late as 1545, when the Mary Rose sank, we find loads and loads of longbows, arrows, and archers on board at the time. Yeah, where really most people in continental Europe had completely stopped using bows, and even to a large extent crossbows, as well as completely switched over to firearms. That much is true. But in fact, we are in the mid of the 16th century. At the beginning of at the time of Flodden, it's different, right? He says, so the English were a bit backwards. The question is, and I would like to stress again, as Schwerpunkt, they were a bit backwards compared to continental developments, but they weren't, in fact, this great different in terms of overall effectiveness, combined arms capacity, and definitely they weren't lagging behind the Scots in this. Easton says the question is, if the new fangled horse and weapon was the pike used, here I'm, YouTube scripts are terrible, right? Automated scripts. So I'm just reading that. Probably some word is wrong with this man. It says, is the pike used in conjunction with firearms, and the English were still using bills with longbows? How on earth did they manage to win against the Scots at the Battle of Flodden? So methodological flow of this premise, of course, he at some point in the video, I remember, makes quote-unquote win. So he always points out, did they actually do that? So he leaves this open, so he's not sort of forcing hand on this. It's, however, still a question which does not quite correspond to the combined arm tactics that were employed, if anything, by the same English. And this is also, in fact, a lost chance of showing, for example, the effectiveness of the longbow during this battle, which instead gets somehow skipped over. Well, as you know, I criticize it in the past also because he attributes to missile weapons in general a greater capacity than even infantry, as we were saying before, like, I don't know, pikemen emerging and stuff. But there are other videos in which he says this is not the one, but say just to defend, or mainly to defend gunners, that's not quite the thing. And so, as we'll learn now, the English win. I would go as far as saying that they win the Battle of Flodden exactly because they weren't fighting. While the Scots were virtually fighting with pikes as a whole, the English were fighting with combined arm tactics, right? And also, as always, battle lines, alternation of combats and so on is what actually settles the matter. And I would like to stress, this is not a battle that, because there is, as we'll see now, a citation that Easton rightly comes up with that says that, bills performed better than pikes in this battle. There are other authors that he mentions that I found, also others today as I was researching, which there was a tendential preference also in context that were, for example, fenced. This is not necessarily war per se, so it's something slightly different. But there was this idea, of course, that especially into one-to-one combat, in certain circumstances, of course, being equipped with a bill would be more convenient with a pike. And this is what I have no problem with. In fact, most of Easton's videos, as you understand also by his own style, sticks to this, right, as a general inquiry. But let's go on. He says, not just likely was a crushing victory. He says, the English lost a few thousand men, maybe estimates of between sort of 2,000 and 4,000 men, and the Scots maybe lost as many as 10,000 men. Well, I would like to stress that the armies were, again, in a few tens of thousands, so losing 4,000 men, it's not really, it's more than 1/10 of your forces. And when a unit loses 1/10 of their forces, they're pretty badly mauled, even if they won. In fact, the English here, yes, win the day. It's a beautiful battle. They handled themselves pretty well, I must say, from a tactical standpoint. For a living, I evaluate these things, as a matter of fact. And the Scots suffered as many as 10,000 men. And as we'll see, we'll talk now about the size of the armies. The Scots would have been something between 30,000 40,000 men, which seems also a bit too big, generally speaking. Probably these armies, the actual fighting forces were slightly smaller, right? But the scale is correct, right? And the Scottish numerical advantage is likely correct as well. But they were also pretty similar. If you go to the maximum, the English may have around 30,000 men. The Scots also maybe, if you look at the lower figure. So they're not that far away in quantity. It's not a crushing advantage, whatever. So it was still more like a 1 versus 1, right? It's not a multiple scale. He says it was a crushing Scottish defeat, so why did the bill defeat the pike? So this is not technically what happened. Or at least there were instances in the battle in which a scale in the battle where this happened, right? But it's not like the battle was won by the bill because there was billmen that fought against pikemen. That's not the thing. And Easton is aware of this. He says, is the bill a better weapon than the pike? Well, divergent sources give us any clue. He says, in fact, yes, they do. There is a few things interestingly written at this time about both the bill and pike, particularly at the Battle of Flodden. But also generally as well, we'll get to a general source a little bit later that also mentions the bill versus the pike. So the first thing to mention is that the Highland Scots in their traditional, they were not known for the Highland charge later on, but at this time, even in the early 16th century, we find English Bishop Thomas Raphael. He describes the Highland Scots charging down. He says they were such large and stout men that one wouldn't fall even when 4 or 5 bills struck them. Now that's the ultimate measure of kind of like awesomeness, because a bill is a really formidable weapon. Obviously, we've got a thrusting point at the end here that can be used pretty much like a spear or pike, but you've got a chopping blade, so he's illustrating the quadripartite function of the bill. You've got a hook, which obviously you can pull with, and you've got a spike in the back, which is good for armor penetration. These are big, up to 8-foot-long weapons that have enormous potential to deal out blooming great blows, somewhat akin to a pole axe. So somebody who's presumably wearing mixed armor, some armor, this light armor at this point, receiving multiple blows from one of these and still carrying on is a really impressive thing. And he's talking about, in fact, heavily armored Scotsmen, as we will see now. What does the bishop say about the bills versus pikes? Well, he does actually say something. He specifically says, because of course by this point they knew that Flodden had been a defeat for the Scots. This was actually, I would add as Schwerpunkt, coming from sources that he wrote down. There's a couple of letters sent, as Easton says, to Thomas Wolsey just right after the battle. So it's a very fresh source. All right. It says they knew that the bills had defeated the pikes. It says, or did they? In fact, Easton, again, I would like to stress, Easton knows this is an approximation. He actually rules in favor of this general interpretation, and he says, okay, there is a lot of context. It has to be 100% like this, but he, generally speaking, settles the matter in favor of the bill. But in its specific context, he says, we'll see. He says, our bills shortly disappointed the Scots of their pikes. So, and yeah, this is literally what he says. It says, bear in mind, the pikes were a new introduction in British Isles at this point. Okay, not the pikes. Right, these kind of longer Renaissance type of pikes in their formation, yes, kind of, but not the pikes, definitely. Because they weren't widespread, and there were even new weapons, more or less, to the Scots. Easton says, yes, the Scots have the tradition of the schiltern, but really the schiltern is not quite the same thing as a pike block. Yeah, well, technically is. It's not a pike square. It's not a, again, as we were describing before, a column that can advance, but maintaining formation aggressively against opponents, right? It's something else. And he says, although there are similarities. And the bishop says that the enemy could not resist the bills that light it so thick and sore upon them. Now, what is a slightly vague statement, but I think most people interpret that as the fact that the relatively thin and light pikes are being struck down by the bills, and he potentially breaking, damaging, chopping the pikes. And by the way, we will read it at the end of the video, but I don't know why Easton is leaving this out, but the entire citation is actually longer. It says basically, we'll see it in the end, that the Scots, first of all, these guys that had been attacked, that had received so many blows, were very well equipped, like they have very heavy armor. And it says that the bills of the English obliged, if anything, the Scots to abandon their pikes, then pass through the swords, and that's where the bills soar upon them, right? Because they were also longer than the swords. This is what the citation actually says. I don't know why he left that out, right? Also for the effectiveness of the bills. So if you said what he said before about the armoredness of the Scots in the passage, you will see again in the end, it would have been somehow more effective to the wall point. We'll get to it at the end of the video as well with the quotes.
Now he takes the path of saying it's basically a mechanical issue here, that the billmen compelled the pikemen to abandon their weapons, but as a matter of fact, it seems to be describing more of a broader combat dynamic, right? The bishop doesn't seem to be specifying, okay, this is about breaking shafts, which would have happened as we will see now, but let's say it's more like a formation, a type of trooper that in this battle described as more successful than the pikemen, and that pressed them in a way that obliged them eventually to discard their pikes.
Easton goes, says, so what is the answer? Is it the fact that bills and perhaps some halberds mix in there and some partisans, but chopping and trussing pole arms essentially chop up the pikes? Well, actually, it's not a totally outlandish suggestion, speaking of the fact that which is true, by the way, materially speaking, you can definitely break the shafts of the pikes with hacking them with bills and similar pole arms. And I agree with Matt Easton, by the way, that you can absolutely break this, but I also think that it wasn't such a common event, nor that fundamentally such type of combat mostly involved as a general mean to victory, to simply break the shaft of the pikes. And also just point in front of you how you have to get on the side of the pike to adequately hack it down to multiple blows. So that's not what normally happens. In fact, also, Easton doesn't actually, at this point, force too much. He says, some people suggest you can't chop through a pike. In fact, we've done experiments where we've chopped against spear shafts made of ash like this. But it's also absolutely uncontroversial. I mean, I know it without being, an experimental archaeologist. I don't know which kind of people thinks this. All kind of things happen. You can definitely chop like a spear shaft. Doesn't matter how resistant it is. These things did happen, and it's just a basic logic. It says, and in fact, with a few blows, you can't usually chop into them if you chop at the right angle. Usually on the sort of third or fourth blow, the shaft will snap. So it is possible. We know that because we've done it, we recreated this. So yeah, I agree with Matt Easton there. But moreover, we also find period references to this. We even find this in treatises. So you talk about Achille Marozzo, Opera Nova. There are treatises from 1536. This is for the sake. Again, it says that there is the shaft down, broken. There's a two-handed swordman is fighting with the other guy with this broken weapon. So again, this is not so important even for the subject. And interestingly enough, Easton says, what of course I love to hear, but as is often the case with battles, it's not necessarily down to the individual weapons or individual processes. It's down to group tactics. It's not even necessarily, it's never about to the individual weapons or individual prowess, right? It's always about group tactics. It's all about tactics to begin with, right? And the bigger, in fact, formations for sure as well. So something, the most distant thing you can imagine from weapons per se. And he says, and when we're looking at the Battle of Flodden, there is a very important point to bear in mind. Pike blocks work on coordination. They require a fair amount of training and training with each other and knowing how to deploy and use pikes in such a way that you stay coordinated, don't create openings in the pike block. Yeah, pikes are also famously quite monodirectional. Yes, you can raise them up or lower them down, but if you get attacked from over here, is talking about the side in the video, an individual can turn around pretty quickly. But if you're an entire mass of men, particularly if your pike is down at all, you can't at all turn around like that because the pikes would get tangled up. Of course, like a man occupies a different space in depth than in width, and so obviously you can't simply change front. Right, there are specific maneuvers exactly to change front. And Easton said this was a factor that we see in the ancient world when the Romans are fighting people using pikes. Yeah, even though again, normally you were channeled to the front of the pikes. That's conventional warfare, and only if you, as a whole force, even if these are not pikemen, you attack them from the flank. But also the Roman legions attacked from the flank were done for. Like look at Battle of Pharsalus. I mean, that's just one example. It's kind of obvious for any army, right? There is not a surprise for anyone. Easton says, and it's equally a problem in the Renaissance world, and they had specific troop types. For example, those people with the big two-handed swords to protect the flanks of pike blocks, because pike blocks were vulnerable to flank and rear attacks. Funnily enough, this I can't really stand as well. It says they're actually in some ways better turning to face the rear than they are to point at the sides. Well, okay, he doesn't imply that that's how they would normally fight, but I would like to stress that this has literally nothing to do with how armies fought. Like no army simply turned with a guy on himself 180 degrees and that's how you fight with a rear. The formations are constituted by men that have a very specific order. The guys in the rear lines can't simply turn and face an enemy. They don't have the capacity, the coordination, the experience. This never happens, right? If you want to do that, you have to do a maneuver that is called counter marches. So basically, you have to make the file advancing, wheeling about, and coming back and realigning with the change front. It's an extremely complex maneuver. We've seen it since, I don't know, there are interesting treatises. We've seen it also for the Spartan drill. Renaissance pikemen were trained to do so, by the way, but no unit whatsoever turns 180 degrees and is combat functional. Like if you're attacked from the rear, you're done for. Like whoever you are doesn't matter by any stretch of the imagination. In any case, he says, so it's better to do that than turning. Like, yeah, geometrically, yes, but again, in terms of combat logic, it has no application whatsoever. Then he says, okay, they're particularly vulnerable to flanking attacks, and for that reason, on the battlefield, they're often arranged in such a way to protect each other from flanking attacks. So I hate reading this because, again, we're things that we know, but I'm trying also to spot something that may be useful for our criticism. And okay, this says there is a suggesting a number of the sources and implication that the ground, the boggy ground, the wet, undulating, and even ground, and we find this equally in the ancient world as well as Macedonians. Sometimes this was a problem for the Scottish pikes, and there is an implication in the sources that the pike block became disorganized. He's talking about Flodden here, which is indeed the case, because as we'll see now, there is a sort of a bottom sort of stream marshy area where they get into and they disorder themselves. This created a lot of problems to the Scots, but it's not how they simply lost, as we will see now. And this meant that the English billmen, could get into them. Now, again, we read the line from the Bishop of Durham, but as you understand, it's also a relatively vague statement. Yes, that there are battle accounts also in later medieval history in the early modern age. It says, okay, well, this weapon was more useful than this other. What interestingly the bishop says that Easton does not say here is that in the very same phrase, the bishop says that the bill had been more useful than the bow, which would actually be had done more damage than the bow, which actually would be a very interesting way to see that somehow the English did believe surely that the bows could make a devastating damage as they had historically done. I've been countering, as you know, ad nauseum, the concept that missile weapons were the game changer and or settler of the matter. There were always some auxiliary force, but it's not like they didn't cause heavy casualties, especially in mass. So this, as we will see now, combined arms, bills plus longbows is what mostly makes it if we're looking at combined arm tactics, actually what made it is how the battle unfolded with the battle lines as usual, because that's by habit what happens and how you have to reconstruct battles. But in this regard, we don't have any evidence from the battle itself that literally says, look, at the end of the day, the battle was won because these guys had this kind of weapon, these others had this other kind of weapon. There is a specific time in the battle which you see this, and it makes sense, the idea that there is a disordered pike formation, as it did happen in Flodden, by the way, 100%. They were more easily, not that easily, because they fought in pretty painful ways, as we will see now, for hours, with this alleged asymmetry. So it wasn't an immediate game changer at all. Also for these pikes that evidently weren't simply disordered in the moment if they went on for hours to fight in that same place, by the way, the marshy terrain, etc. So yeah, this is a very important historiographical criticism. You can't pick phrases like this and say, okay, well, basically it's the bill that made it. Right, the Battle of Flodden was actually settled by the fact that, look, the English had the bill, and here the Scots, for some reason, had the pike that got disorder, and they won it. And as we'll see now, I have the entirety of the battle sorted out, all the various movements, and that explain to you how that battle was effectively settled. So, a bit of perspective in here. That's not what the Bishop of Durham literally says. It says that, in this sense,
the billmen overcame the pikemen at some point of the fight. This is what he says. And as we'll see in the end, this is even further mitigated because the bishop says that the bills had done better than the bows in this battle, and we know that the bows were not actually a fight settler, right? They were just an auxiliary component, and the heavies were introduced. So this is actually also mixing a bit like the concept of combined armed tactics of heavy and light infantry in this case. On top of this, we're told that the Scots discarded their pikes as they were under pressure of the billmen, and they were defeated eventually as they were fighting with the sword. So it's yet an extra step that mitigates further the simple and alleged dominance of the bill, even in this in this specific combat.
This is not really even describing a specific phase of the battle if you read the account. This is a general statement about how the battle had gone. So it's really an approximation. It's meant, literally speaking, just not to say, okay, here I made the battle reconstruction, here, look in this place, the bills actually bit the pikes, and so from here everything crumbled. So it's actually about the bills, or the entire formation. It was billmen versus pikemen. They were defeated. No, none of this is there. Nobody would have ever written something like this. First of all, because this thing did not happen really, and secondly, it's totally normal to read this stuff, right? We find, I don't know, there are some battle accounts from the Swiss of the earlier period that say, oh, look, with this halberd, we cut through the plate of the nobleman, and we kill them like that. Yeah, okay, but eventually, how did the battle actually go? Like, in terms of battle lines and how they engaged with one another, how long they fought, what was happening overall, right? Of course, a modernistic mindset that is setting. So here he talks about yet another treatise, and he talks about the fact that indeed, and he shows this. I love when on scholagladiatoria he does he uses these halberds with incredibly fast movements. I also feel like, watch out. I mean, I don't have to tell him. He teaches this stuff, but it shows you the actual historical fluidity. In that sense, scholagladiatoria is extremely useful of weapons, how fast, quick the movements were, how actually non-heavy these weapons were, how handy and manageable in good hands they were. I would like also to stress one thing. It gets often underrated here, at least in this video. Matt Easton doesn't point it out, but it's surely out there in some of his other works, namely the fact that, individually speaking, in terms of fencing, strictly speaking, using a bill is a much more complicated, requires a much greater training than a pike. Right, what you have to be trained for as a pikeman is operating information. By using a weapon like the bill that has 4 distinct functions, as we've seen before, a fracturing one, a puncturing one, a cutting one, a hooking one, is something that only a person with some specific individual skill can use. And obviously, in a broken formation where things tend towards smaller combats, of course, that increasingly has an importance. But as we'll see now, it's not like battle lines disappeared during this battle, nor that, again, billmen simply defeated pikemen, also because this is also the elephant in the room that also Easton acknowledges in the video. Of course, pikes overran this type of weapons, all right? People did not go, even before this time, he talks also about the later Renaissance where he says, okay, well, the shot advances, people were less armored, because I actually criticized him once in one of the other videos in which he claimed that weapons like double-handed swords, this kind of halberds, bills, etc., were incredibly effective against pike blocks. And actually in this very video, he says something different, namely that if the pike block was compact, like it was actually it overrun this kind of units equipped with that kind of... I don't think he goes as far as the unit, but it says overall the push of the pike was stronger. That's exactly the case, but in this sense, it doesn't make much sense to claim that in a broader sense, those were particularly effective weapons against pike squares, all right? And infantries at large fought primarily with pikes in the front lines, also regardless of cavalry, also in the previous centuries. So there would be much to be said about this, and why, in fact, at Flodden, and this is the point, and that's why I stressed at the beginning, we'll see it better now, that he somehow said that this is the end of the video, the point that he makes, as we'll see now also, that the Scots were too ahead for their times in this kind of reform that would have allegedly made, and they were kind of less armored, but the English were more armored, and they had this pikes, and since the Scots disordered themselves, the English won like that. That's not what happened, right? That's essentially a two-weapon focused, as tendentially always. This is my bottom line of my general criticism towards this kind of videos. It's always about the weapon. It's not much about how the battle really went, because none of this is discussed in this video, for that matter. And that's literally the single most important thing, right? This focus narrows it down to kind of what kind of weapons they were using at the end of the day. So there's this other factor, yes, disorder, which units of pikes were actually disordered in which moment, like what happened, right? How were reserves used, how outflanking maneuvers were carried out. This is not much explained. They weren't just billmen doing that. So he talks about a later 16th century manual that praises the bill, but essentially doesn't say that, of course, was more important than the pike, also because the pike was obviously even more dominant at the time than Flodden. So it shows what I was saying before, this incredibly fast movements at close range would have given an edge, unlike the pike that was sort of wieldy and did not work well outside of formation. Again, it's not like these units that at Flodden fought out of formation either, right? This is the point that he makes. He says, so the implication here is that the English at Flodden not only did encounter Scots with pikes who were disorganized and therefore creating openings in the unit, but they could also come in close and use their bills in close in range in ways where the pikemen quite simply couldn't use their pikes for anything useful. Now, the only problem, as Schwerpunkt, as I'm saying, is that none of the battle accounts actually claim this, right? Durham is the closest, right? He literally says what this general picture would have looked like, but he doesn't actually explain this. You see, in the point we cited before, Sarin upon them and so on, it's something that also speaks of some moral force involved. And there is no other battle account that says, here the billmen opened gaps among the pikemen, they exploited, they chopped them. So even if this actually happened, right, we're not told that at some point the pike formations fractured because they were specifically under the pressure of the bills, right? They did crack under the pressure of the bills, but as we'll see now, also because they were partially, yes, disordered as units, meaning that it's not necessarily even that they gave more opportunity to the billmen to do what Easton is saying. That surely happened during Battle of Flodden, there's no doubt. It did contribute to the English victory, but in general, as we'll see now, there were attacks from the side, there are numerical considerations, there is also a very protracted engagement, as we'll see now. And so, at large, yeah, we can say that was a factor, but did actually the battle prove this, like that the bills bit the pikes? Is it the general moral that we should derive from this war? That's not fundamentally what the battle, as we'll see now, suggests. He says, there is one final point I would like you to consider. that says that no one else he thinks has really mentioned in this regard to Flodden, but consider as potentially important. He says, we're talking about the year 1513, the Battle of Flodden, and I think an important factor is armor. Okay, so we know, he says, that there are mentions of armor and its tactical importance. We know that in some cases they put the most armored people, the best armored people went at the front of the pike block. Yes. And he says, why? Because they're pike proof. So pikes are really, really effective against people who aren't wearing very much armor or don't have shields. So I've talked about the problem with coming up against Romans with their large scutum. And again, I also criticize the stuff also because they had multiple pikes coming at them, and where no ancient source, as we repeated ad nauseam, actually ever says the Romans broke a phalanx frontally. The only case is Pitna, the phalanx broke itself on broken terrain, and the Romans eventually overpowered the Macedonians, but there is no evidence that because the Romans had the scutum, or even in that instance, like the Romans had it easy against the phalanx, they never broke it frontally by themselves. So in any case, he says, equally, it's a problem with people who are wearing full plate armor, for example, because where do you stick the pike? So, first of all, I will cite at the end of the video a literal battle account of Flodden that literally says that the Scottish pikes were opening enormous wounds, bleeding the enemy white through their hardness, right? So we have actually the case that the Scottish pikemen at Flodden did tear open people, right, through their own armor. And indeed, pikes were actually used in front lines to pierce people, where or another. This does actually happen, right? Also because pikemen were doing this to one another also at this point. It's true that you don't see many fully plate armored forces out there, but it is also because exactly pikes become dominant even over these people, right? If it had taken just to be fully plated armored to withstand pikemen, I don't know, the Burgundians should have won wars, right? You don't even have to wait, again, that shots take away armor, as Easton is about to make this point. They were just superior because it doesn't matter what kind of armor you're using. On the contrary, it's more effective actually to be less armored, even regardless of shots.
If you can be, in fact, yourself this
better drilled, larger pike columns than something else, right? Also, I would write, and so we will look at that citation later. But the other point is, he says like that here. This is slightly more controversial from my side, that the Scots did not have shields because we're using the pike with both hands. So I don't want to say too much, but I've been researching this stuff for myself, and I think there is more than enough evidence to suggest that, not just at Flodden, of course, this is not controversial. Not all soldiers were pikemen, right? And there were shields, even though this was not much a time of shields, but Britain was a bit rustic, in particular Scotland as well, for, of course, pavises to have been still there.
As we'll see in the end, we're told by the same Bishop of Durham that the Scots were pretty darn well armored and did use pavises. That's the entire phrase at the beginning.
Pike and shot warfare was yet to fully develop even at this point, but it's also something depending on big states that can afford this. There is properly a scale, right, a threshold that you have to surpass to be able to field such type of forces in a functional way, right? You can have composites. You can have a section of the line that is pikes and others that is, good old billmen or pikemen in the older, say, medieval fashion. These things happen and would happen at Flodden.
Which is yet the other important aspect. The Scots would have had their own billmen, will sit better in the end, their own low-caliber axes, whatever. So this is not mentioned by the sources, but it would have been normal, right, at the time.
On top of this, I think that actually a substantial part of the Scots did actually use shields, and that even pikemen actually did use shields at some point. The pavis, the smaller types of pavises definitely existed. The pavises, let's completely get rid of the myth that here I'm not talking about scholagladiatoria, but it's very insisted that because of a certain type of medievalism, especially revolving around the stereotypical 15th century, where the pavis was just some camping table held by someone to shield either the crossbow or during sieges, whatever. Pavises were used also by rank and file trooper. We know this very well throughout all of Western Europe, and we can absolutely think that even though it's very difficult to bear a pavis, even though slung on your shoulder and holding a pike, fixing it on the ground, resisting a cavalry charge, this is definitely possible, right? And especially in the presence of heavy cavalry charges, heavy quarrels, fire, pikemen, we're told, were very vulnerable in many ways to crossbow bolts, because they couldn't simply shield themselves immediately, as they were indeed not capable of simply raising the shields. They had to hold both hands with a pike, so that was a vulnerability. But some of them were actually wearing pavismen. So this is a thing. Again, this may be the most controversial thing. This is absolutely debatable on some level, but overall, don't think even that this bearing a pavis, also relatively small. The pavis, what actually defines the pavis is the thickness of the shield. Very few people know this. They think it's the size or the shape. No, it's the thickness of how it is. It's actually in the etymology of the term as well, pavire, which means to, just like the etymology of pavement, it's something stratified, right? To prevent, in fact, piercing more than else. So completely off tangent. There is no. This was just my personal tangent. It's not important to discuss it further, right? But this idea that, as we'll see now, Eastern develops as but historians of Flodden have never taken consideration armor. And I knew why he was coming up with that, because I already heard what he thinks about this in another video. And he makes the point here, says, if you've got large pauldrons and a closed helmet and you've got fully encased arms and legs and torso, what's the pike going to do? It's just going to slide off you. So if you can't put your nobles, for example, if we put the Scottish nobles and James IV and other people in the front of the rank of the pikemen, you essentially make the front of the pike block pike proof. Right, okay? And now the saying goes in reverse. If you have the English billmen wearing quite a bit of plate armor, the front ranks are kind of pike-proof. Are they? Because, again, we literally have a source telling us for the Battle of Flodden that the English were massacred through their harness by Scottish pikemen, right? As they were also being pushed, as we'll see now, back by the Scottish advance. So, again, things happen, right? As we said before, if you can break a pike shaft, you can also at some point pierce somebody. That doesn't even necessarily have to have a full plate armor, right? How many people are going to have a literally full plate armor in the front ranks overall? Like it's going to cost an incredible lot. There were, right? But there is, in fact, a collective dimension. And there are stocks, there are various weapons you can use in this incredibly ferocious combat. So I don't like actually where this is going. It says, so essentially he's saying that, literally I'm reading, the English billmen can close in and close beyond the range of the pikes and start chopping up the pikemen, because what can the pikes do to them? I'd never really heard of this. This is, again, the idea that pikes were there for no reason, that they were introduced in the pike square. It was just because they were more lightly armored opponents, which is, I think here, if I remember correctly, as we'll see now, the point is making also about the Scots. Since we're trained this Renaissance where they actually had less armor, but the English actually were better armor for some reason. This doesn't actually hold water, right? Otherwise, everybody would have just had, fully plated guys fencing off Swiss pikes. That's not how it went. Right. They tried and they got themselves killed, by the way, for the record. And Easton says it's going to slide off the armor again. So now you might say, he says, well, why doesn't that apply to later periods? And yeah, okay, but why doesn't this apply also for these very periods? Right? Because that's how he's finding the explanation to what happened at Flodden. He sees this, again, to a large measure, not completely, but to a large measure in the end, as a thing between billmen and pikemen. Says, now what's interesting is we go later in the 16th century, we find infantry wear less and less armor. In 1513, Battle of Flodden is early in the 16th century. People are still dressing quite a lot of armor like they were in the late Wars of the Roses. Okay, we're not yet into the era where there is so much gunpowder that people have just started shedding the armor, because there is not a lot of point in wearing it anymore. By the time you get into the 17th century, the English Civil War, for example, over the 30 Years or the 30 Years War, we find your typical pikeman very often only has a helmet. He only has a helmet and a buff coat. Sometimes they have a cuirass, sometimes they have a breastplate, but their arms and their legs and their face are uncovered, right? Which actually was the case also for most soldiers at Flodden, I would argue. In fact, later, I can tell it to you now how the troops at Flodden were actually armored, right? The question of armor, I wrote this, and the surviving sources do not support any systematic English superiority, right? There's no systematic English superiority in armor at Flodden. I would say, as Schwerpunkt, that tendentially, yes, the Scots were in their harness, generally speaking, more archaic, primitive. So if this was a draw, probably the English were better equipped. But when we look at these large armies, it doesn't make any sense to make this comparison. We're largely equipped, also because the majority of troops were not actually heavily armored, right, as we intended, or at least to be immune to pikes, by the way. That, again, the English had this massive edge because of that. There isn't an evidence of this. The Scottish front ranks, this is what I'm saying as Schwerpunkt, had been deliberately packed with the best harnessed men, nobles in full imported plate or in Almain rivet, supported by heavy wooden pavises as well. This is the idea that I dealt precisely, and I'm not alone. There are other scholars that think this for Flodden, precisely in order to resist both missiles and the points of enemy weapons. English billmen certainly received munition-grade breast and back pieces and helmets from the royal arsenals. So this is the point that Mason does. Yet the rank and file of both armies relied upon a broadly comparable mixture of plate, brigandine, mail, and simple head protection. The notion that English billmen were uniquely pike-proof while Scottish pikemen were not is difficult to sustain from the contemporary description that have come down to us. Right, and this is, I think, really self-explanatory. I mean, where's the evidence of this? Like, there was an army here that was, again, just because they had bills and armor, there were common rank and file soldiers that they could simply overwhelm. I don't know, the front line of sort of the foot Scottish noblemen with pikes, because they had bills. This doesn't quite hold water. Not even if you say, okay, the formation was disordered, right? And we'll see now also in part other considerations, because there is an idea that also these men passed to swords, and the swords were shorter than in bills. Is partially true, but we also find, as we'll see now, from the side of the Highlanders in the battle, swordsmen and bowmen combination that actually pushed the English back as well. So these armies were not basing themselves just on one type of troop, right? Even the Scots that I said myself before were fundamentally and largely pikemen, still had their own missile element, right? Minority, whatever you want, but it was still there, right? They even had cavalry. So again, regardless of the quantities, I'm not going to make that thing because it's easier to look at how even properly the numbers of the single lines and how they engage and from which side that settles the matter. But again, here what Easton is suggesting and actually asking historians, just because he asked, I'm going to answer, no, we don't have any evidence that was the case, right? He tries to argument and says there is a big difference here. Okay, so if you're coming up against pikemen, he says, and you happen to have a good amount of armor, let's say you put down the pike for a second. Okay, now this is him in the video putting down the pike. For a second, he passes to the bill, says, let's say you're an English royal equipped billman. And we know at this time the English had arsenals. We're churning out armor, munition, great armor. This is mass-produced cheap plate armor for equipping the levied troops, giving them bills. All right. So again, cheap plate armor from head to toes did not exist. Like there was, of course, it was always very expensive. It was expensive to be effective to begin with, and full plate armor was gradually being abandoned and deputed only for the very ultra elite, right? Also because, frankly, the effects of gunpowder were already there, right? They were not simply, even in places like England, etc., it was felt, right? The types of armor they imported were mostly, as you know, from Italy, from Germany. So this is not much of a point. It's true that the English produced them as well, but at large, they actually tended to import them still. So they had surely these arsenals as far as for producing relatively cheap plate armor, but only some set pieces and other types of armor. As we said before, brigandines, still mail was there in part. So that these were totally pike-proof ultra armored, sealed troops as the final rank? No. All right. And formations fight also with, of course, they're best in the front. They're going to be better armored, but it's not going to be that moment of ultra heavy armoredness. It was truly the 15th century, even in the early 16th, even though there wasn't an enormous abyss in between, was still already tending toward lighter equipment. And Easton says this would be provided by the government. The armor would be provided by the government. You're wearing quite a bit of armor, okay, kind of what we would call 3/4 armor. If you're equipped like that, you're quite well protected against pikes. So I think that one thing that's been overlooked when we talk about the Battle of Flodden is that armor probably played a large part in the pikes' relative ineffectiveness. Again, if that had been the case, it would have been the case also in the continent, and we actually don't find any battle anywhere, like in history, where billmen defeated pikemen. So the strong suspicion, even before looking at the battle tactics, is that, of course, as in any other battle, actually what kind of weapons they used was virtually irrelevant compared to also because there were also somehow symmetric. There were actually very similar armies to one another. So those elements were relatively tending to zero. Again, I don't think there is any evidence that here we're not in industrial times. Like, it's not like England had this strong edge in armor that is at the same time here called cheap, that I don't know, they had found a way to withstand pikemen. And it seems more important, of course, that the same pikemen got disordered there in a broader collective sense, but we don't have any practical evidence that there was a quantitative edge of English armoredness that was sort of relevant to explain how the battle went the way it did. It's a beautiful battle, but it's in fact in this sense also quite understandably going in a certain way because of how the whole situation was handled from both sides rather than what kind of armor they were wearing, right? So this is all because scholagladiatoria's mindset tends to maintain this material horizon, where if here you see the pike for some reason doesn't harm, right? The pike does harm and actually also a lot, right? And even if you're armored, you have to watch out. Like for pretty much any weapon that was used on the battlefield, you can have many different types of trauma. It's all about the broader compaction of a force, right? The testing can help, but surely the English are not historically wearing such level of armor that rendered pike warfare ineffective, right? That seems to me fairly doesn't make much sense, right? Telling the truth. And especially considering the scale and the quantity, because again, if the Scots could stop English cavalry, English knights in the early 14th century with their children, it's not like at this point magically the English have such more armor that can break through the pikes in general. And the Scots also are sitting ducks. It is true that the Scots are less comprehensively equipped, but again, the actual measure of this is where, like the Scots themselves were using here full plate armor themselves. They also distributed through their own monarchic arsenals in a smaller fashion than the English, but also through their clients and the provisioning systems, their array standards with some decent level of armoredness.
As we hinted at before, actually the Bishop of Durham says that the Scots were pretty well armored.
Here I can think that there is a perspective distortion in the measure by which the 15th century habituated us with these small armies that were, however, quite highly armored due to some certain professional dynamics of the era and the type of warfare was fought at the time. Here we're looking at an unusually large army, and so the more that is the case, the cheaper overall the armor is going to be for the rank and file soldier. This is also just a greater standard. I don't think that England had the means to provide pike-proof armor, whatever that is supposed to be, to an entire host in any significant way to overwhelm the Scots. The truth is that armor had nothing to do with how this battle was won or lost, or at least it was by a few points percentage, not even, really. Now, he says, later in the 16th century, with more firearms, there is less armor, so he makes the same point. He says, what do you think about my theories? What do you think about my ideas? None of these are the revolutionary except the consideration of armor, which I haven't seen mentioned by any kind of Flodden historians really much up until this point, but armor clearly played a part because it is mentioned in some sources, but overall we've got to set the context here because I love to set the context on this channel where pikes overall did succeed, and while the bill triumphed at Flodden, that was really the last notable triumph of the bill as a battlefield weapon, not long. Also the only one, if this were true, by the way, I would add not long after this, Henry VIII started adopting pikes, and pretty much by the middle of the 16th century, everyone around Europe was using pikes in conjunction with firearms. So in the end, the pike had the last laugh, but at the Battle of Flodden, the bill did really very well. Well, again, this is based on, it's not based on speculation. I mean, we do know, obviously, that if the English used bills, they were functional. But this is exactly the point. Also, if people used pikes from the other, that they were functional. Again, there isn't a way to dodge this. Also with a greater armored edge, whatever. They were two conventional armies. They were also much more similar than we think in form and substance. They bit the hell out of one another, as we're going to see now, regardless of even what kind of weapons they were having in their hands, right? So he asks for an opinion. So I prepared an explanation of the Battle of Flodden. It's very schematic. It's not as long as we would make in a probably 2 hours and a half long video just for this side of the story. So let's look first of all at the deployment. By the early afternoon of September the 9th, the two armies faced each other across the shallow valley of the Pellinsburn. The Scots occupied the crest and the northern slope of Branxton Hill after a hasty redeployment from their original strong position on Flodden Edge. The English, after a long, wet and hungry march from Barmore and the successive crossings of the River Till at Witsel Bridge for the van, and the even Milford forts for the main body, because they were proceeding in column formation, right? So as we'll see now, we'll look at the units. There's a van, and then the main behind, formed up on the lower ground to the south of the burn. The slope of Branxton Hill is steep, approximately 1 in 5, which is really a lot, and you can see it also from the pictures, by the way. At its base lies the Pellinsburn, a minor stream swollen by days of heavy rain into a boggy, miry belt of variable firmness that extended for roughly a mile, with only limited practicable crossing points, notably Branksbrigg and Sandeford. Right, so that's the bad terrain for the pikes. The Scots, having moved northward in haste and under a smoke screen of burning wet straw and camp rubbish, were imperfectly acquainted with the precise character of the lower slopes and the soft ground immediately in front of them. The entire frontage of the opposing armies was approximately 2,000 yards. Right, these were two immense armies. We will give a dimension to them now, with the Scottish divisions spaced roughly 200 yards apart from one another, meaning from side to side. All right, so this is the order of battle of the Scottish army, and also the battle array. The Scottish host was arrayed in 4 principal divisions together with a reserve, quite importantly. I want to stress that overall there is cavalry here, and will actually play a great role, especially from the English side, right? But they're mostly, obviously, infantry armies. The Scots left division is led by Alexander III Lord Home and Alexander Gordon, Earl of Huntly, approximately 10,000 men. These are border horsemen and foot together with Highlanders from Aberdeenshire and Moray. The second division, remember, these are one next to the other, right, in the line. On the ridge, William Hay, Earl of Errol, John Lindsay, Earl of Crowford, and William Graham, Earl of Monrose, approximately 7,000 men. These are levies of Perthshire, Angus, Forfar, and Fife. Then there is the Centre Division. King James IV in person leads it. The Swiss Way in the front as a pikeman himself. These are approximately 15,000 men. Royal household, the Earls of Cassilis, Morton, and Rhodes, Lords Harris, Maxwell, and others, Burgesses of Edinburgh, Ayr, and Addington, and Galwegian contingents. The extreme right division, the Scottish line, sees Archibald Campbell, Earl of Argyll, and Matthew Stewart, Earl of Lennox, stiffened by the French cadre of the pikemen. Remember what we said before. So it's just actually a minimal, it's a minority section of the line under the Sieur d'Aussy, approximately 5,000 men. These are Highlanders, right? It's very interesting, by the way, that they were also, and here again, we are not actually told where, by the sources, where the French model, Swiss model pikemen were actually stationed, right? Given that the king himself fought in the front line as a pikeman, which was a custom that the Swiss partially had, that would be adopted by the Spanish historically and the whole imperial habit, however, suggests that we're looking at fairly homogeneous battle lines. It may even be possible that the first ranks of all these divisions were composed of the better drilled pikemen. In any case, the Scots already had, I would like also to stress this, that even though, again, there was the Swiss way of drilling, it's not like, I don't know, in Scotland, nobody knew how to do something similar to that, right? And especially in a country that had such a staunch reliance on pikemen. Again, that video about the Scottish lowland pikemen tells you a bit the whole thing, because as you know, the lowlanders were also the ones that were more directly under the monarchy's control, that were potentially provided with better equipment, greater drill, and whatever. Then you have the Scottish Reserve behind, obviously, commanded by Adam Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, with approximately 5,000 men. These are lowlanders from the Lothians, Ettrick Forest, Galashiels, and Selkirk. Right? This already tells us something interesting, namely the fact that the king probably was counting on some rush on the foe of some sort, because otherwise he would have used his best, not as a reserve. Like he placed here the picked drilled forces in front, plus the Highlanders and even some cavalry. So he's up for some kind of dynamism, and then he leaves the reserve behind for some kind of critical intervention. There is, however, a problem, and I would say this is somehow irrelevant to scholagladiatoria's debate here with me. It has to do with the general strategy that James was to pursue, because he was actually placed in a strong position. The English were arriving, and basically the battle, as we'll see now, starts because the van is in sight and the rest of the English host is not quite there. And so there is this sense that some, at least critics of the battle, said that James did badly. That this, of course, this often also happens as a general judgment of battles. It seems things go badly. You must have actually been a bad commander. This is not quite the case. Like they may superimpose each other's perspective and say it's not always the point, right? It's true that things actually go badly, but also the English, the battle for the Scots, the English also handled themselves pretty well. They were not doing 100% correctly, but they still, again, saved the day in very, very great fashion. And there appear to have been some level of not disorganization of the Scots, but the feeling, as we were saying before, that Easton says the Scots were not the underdogs, they were well trained and equipped. He says it themselves. By the way, he doesn't make the comparison at the end, says the English were better, were well armored at least. And admittedly, he doesn't make the point, okay, the Scots weren't, right? So, but the idea is that, again, the overwhelming majority of the Scots were levies. Right, they weren't, levies trained the Swiss. They were literally the old levies from Scotland, like in the medieval army. Right, so there is the sense that there is something James has to do before also the other sections of the line that he doesn't completely rely upon, because also most of those are actual levies that, may be impetuous, they may want to beat the English and so on, but they also require indeed some order, and naturally for scarcely drilled forces, that is quite difficult to achieve. Scholar does not talk about this. It's not much of a problem per se, but say there is not just terrain breaking them. There is also, because also units eventually march on terrain. It's not like here, the marshy ground was a trap per se, or a unit can't march across it. It's just becoming more difficult for them, and they're getting more disorderly. But generally speaking, the training of these forces is the most important thing. And given that here we're talking about armies that at large were actually not trained for both sides as the pike Scottish way, we're looking at something more similar, in fact, to a medieval battle of the old kind. It's something particularly innovative, right? Then there is this other thing, it turns out to be fairly relevant from the Scottish side, is Scottish artillery, right? It was actually pretty large park, 5 heavy curtles and a number of lighter culverines that had been laboriously dragged into new positions around the site of what is now Brankston Hill Farm. But as we'll see now, they won't work particularly well. So there were, in terms of numbers and artillery, particularly some Scottish advantage. Then the English army, after consolidating from an initial arrangement of 6 divisions into 3 main bodies supported by a mounted reserve, was disposed as follows. Right of the van, so there is the van and the main, right? Right of the van, so there is the first line divided in 3 divisions. This is also very medieval, telling the truth. It says, and in fact, it would have normally been just, say, had this been Wars of the Roses with less manpower, it would have been it, right? But this is a massive army. I would like to stress, like, we'll see the total numbers at the end of the day, something like 24 to 27,000 for the English and 30 to 42,000 for the Scots, right? And I think that, again, the Scots were not 42,000. By the way, their ranks had also been importantly depleted throughout the campaign. It's true that these are the numbers normally given up for the battle at that point, but say it's in fact unrealistic to presume that the Scots had this mobilized for some reason, I don't know, 50,000, but this doesn't make any sense, right? For the battle, especially handling these troops, they were essentially of the same scale of the English, right? The English were, say, for the biggest gap, the English 24,000, the Scots can't even be double that, right? So it's well within, say, 2 point something to the higher end, and the Scots likely something 3 point something, likely in the lower end, right? And possibly even more balanced. In any case, this is not the point, because we will use the numbers for the units. This is very important to understand what happened, because even though the Scots had the broader majority, some battles fought actually numerical difficulty or inferiority, at least with some important mitigating factors as far as their effectiveness was concerned. So again, for the English, you have the right of the van led by Edmund Howard, approximately 3,000 men from Cheshire and Lancashire, contingents including the MacClesfield men under Christopher Savage and the tenants of Vale Royal Abbey, several hundred from South Yorkshire, Hull and Doncaster, and some 200 Marines as well. Center of the van, commanded by Thomas Howard, Lord Admiral. This is the guy in charge, essentially. Approximately 9,000 men, the remaining 1,000 Marines of the fleet, the 2,000 men of the Palatinate of Durham under the banner of St. Cuthbert, commanded by Sir William Bulmer and Lord Lumley. There were these echoes from the wars between the English and the Scots from centuries and centuries, right? It was an important spiritual dimension, the various patron saints and so on. Northumbrian contingents under Lords Ogle and Gascoigne, and substantial Yorkshire forces under Lord Clifford, Lord Conyers, and Lord Scrope of Upsall, and others. The left of the van was commanded by Sir Marmaduke Constable, approximately 2,000 men, a family and affinity grouping reinforced by William Percy's retainers and additional Lancashire men. Then behind, that is arriving, is the main body, the Earl of Surrey, approximately 5,000 men, predominantly Yorkshire men, including Scrope of Bolton's Dales men, the York City contingent, and various gentry companies, right? So you understand how also from both sides, really, this was far from an homogeneous army, right? So overall, yes, they could have had some more concentrated supply systems, but again, the notion that even the English alone would have had this, hyper well-equipped army in the north, they were equipped as they would have been normally equipped, right? So nothing clamorous in terms of armoredness. Then there was a mounted reserve. Lord Dacre was in charge, between 1,500 and 3,500 men. This is a consistent mounted force, as we'll see now. It will be actually very important to counter the Scots. These were border horse and accompanying foot, including Kendal archers in the company of the bastard Heron. The extreme left that was still approaching. This was yet another contingent, was commanded by Sir Edward Stanley, between 3,500 and 5,000 men from Lancashire and Cheshire, delayed by the loss of guides and moving by a more circuitous route through Crookham and the Sandeford crossing. This will turn out to be useful because they will manage, as we will see in the end, to outflank Highlander force, the last functionally resisting on the field, right, due to that circular movement. So if we have to look at the engagements of the Battle of Flodden in sequence, the battle opened with an artillery exchange conducted at ranges of between 600 and 1,500 yards across the Pallinsburn Valley. The heavier Scottish siege pieces positioned on the higher ground either overranged their targets or buried themselves harmlessly in the soft, waterlogged ground of the burn. The lighter English field guns, sakers and serpentines, on the contrary, were handled first of all by more experienced crews and able to fire more rapidly, striking the crowded Scottish ranks with greater effect. Interestingly enough, the psychological impact of this bombardment on the largely untrained Scottish levies was considerable and helped goad the first Scottish advance. Right here, for example, scholagladiatoria does not talk about artillery, does not talk about cavalry, does not talk about longbowmen. It's all about the billmen. Well, yeah, there were the rank and file heavy infantry, there is no doubt, but overall, appreciate also the quite interesting combined arm picture here. I would like to also stress that even though the Royal Field Artillery at this point in history, while being enucleated as such, was not particularly performing in general, it was more like a nuisance and somehow here to create problems to armies, to have this morally shattering ethics of some sort, softening up the enemy formations rather, was, however, as we will see now better, also somehow effective as the Scots were advancing, because the English kept firing, right? And we are told by the sources of the battle expressly that there were significant casualties among the Scots. This is not just because they were compact or in a phalanx, again, they were pikemen per se, but it's obvious that considering also how many they were, like shooting to them would have been kind of easier, and those things were a problem, especially if you relied on the cohesion of a pike square where everybody follows their lead. I mean, this is true also from the English side, admittedly, but as we've seen, Scottish artillery underperforms. There is no ricochet fires, so the ground is soft, whatever. The English instead shoot straight into the Scots as they approach, so they cause more casualties. So there is this first phase where the Scottish left division. So here again, you have essentially the two battle lines. Again, the English main has still to arrive to the battlefield, and James decides to go at the van. All right. So at this, and it goes in this echelon fashion. The various divisions, a typical deployment of the era, telling the truth. Very late medieval in many ways. The Scottish left division fought against the English right of the van on a relatively open ground west of the worst mire. This ground actually favors the Scots, and this is actually also the place where we're told later that those pikemen were actually wounding the English through their harness, right? Goaded by the English fire, the Scottish left division under Home and Huntley, approximately 10,000, numbers are important, let's remember them, was the first to advance. On this western sector, the ground was less obstructed by the worst of the Pallinsburn mire and offered a relatively level approach. Holmes' borders and Huntley's Highlanders therefore struck Edmund Howard's wing, approximately 3,000, with considerable force and momentum. As you understand, numbers here are overwhelmingly in Scottish favor. These pikemen are, however, levies, right? And they're not this huge much overall. They are essentially driving. And here, by the way, this is a general reconstruction of the battle. We're told 10,000 Scotsmen against 3,000 Englishmen. Say, here the debate is, should have James waited for committing his forces. He had a strong defensive position. He could have waited for the English. He probably didn't trust his levies, right? And he thought, like, if we have this numerical advantage, we can't wipe out the van and then fall that may be actually an ill conception on the English main, even though they didn't know where they were at this point, say not at all, but they literally didn't see them. So again, there is a debate on this. We're not here to, this is not a video about the Battle of Flodden per se. I mean, it turns out to be, but it's not, again, the tactical, very constructed stuff from primary. So, I mean, I searched, primary sources will quote different ones, but let's say in a bigger sense, we will explain in that kind of video what the Battle of Flodden was about. So we're told 10,000 Scots, because we're looking here at the armies. It was, again, we're giving the Scots the benefit of what scholarship normally conventionally says. They had so many troops. In my opinion, again, they didn't have 40,000 men on the field, but this may be just, it's likely that they didn't. I just can't, nobody can prove it, as a matter of fact. These are just overall estimates. But say 10,000 versus 3,000 at that point. Also from the English side, again, they stood their ground, as we will see now, at least not these guys in particular, but they had some capacity of recompaction, right? And what happens here when the Scottish left hits the English right on this level ground was good for pikemen, is that Howard's Cheshire and Lancashire men, already uneasy at finding themselves placed under an unfamiliar commander. There is all a background. Again, we're not here to look at it, but we're looking at all the mitigating tactical factors from both sides rather than under Stanley, largely broke and fled. Many of the Yorkshire gentlemen likewise gave way. So this should have been, again, the the gentlemen, the best ones that would have been effective against the pikes, right? Overwhelmed, right? Edmund Howard and a corps of retainers nevertheless did make a desperate stand. Howard himself was thrice beaten down, yet rose again each time. This is what instead exactly Matt Easton may have. We're not told by which weapon, but it could be that thing, like beaten down by pikemen, but he was well armored enough to make a stand, but still pushed back. This is also to show you how things actually work when you have pikemen against you. Notable English casualties, and these were all very well armored men, in this phase included Sir Brian Tunstall, several Cheshire and Lancashire knights, and Maurice Berkeley of the Marines. So again, this is just by sort of basic acknowledgement how battles are fought. Nobody says, oh my god, they had pikes from one side, that the other had good armor. These guys, it's not like they didn't have to die, but there was this edge they could take on the pikemen because they had, armor and builds. And so on flat ground here we see how it doesn't work. Admittedly, again, Easton acknowledges, I think the script that I read from YouTube, he says at some point, I think the YouTube may have missed it, but he does say at some point, of course, there is this push of the pike that is overwhelming at some point in a collective formation. So he accentuates just like the condition in which for Flodden, in which the pikemen would have been disordered, right? But here we see what happens in fact when they're not disordered, right? And because to make his point, like if, as he claimed, like the pikemen formation is broken, you don't even need to say that the pike does not work against a heavily armored opponent. Because at that point, they would have passed to a sword if they had it, especially if they were noblemen, they were heavies, really, and they did have side weapons of that kind. Because there would have not been a way to fight with a pike against a guy that would do everything possible to close in range, even though, again, the pike formation could have been still fairly compact. Again, Easton knows this, right? And just trying to smoothen the fact that armor would have been this sort of particularly relevant aspect of the story. Now, back to our Scottish left and English right. At this critical moment, Lord Dacre, interestingly enough, brought his mounted reserve, as we've seen before, something between 1,500 and 3,500 men, forward from behind the English lines into the exposed flank of the now disordered Scottish left division, 10,000 men, remember. So consider the numbers. Like you have 3,000 infantry that pins the Scots down. It's not completely crushed. The English right wing, we'll see it better now. There's a sort of stall in the end of the day, because this other cavalry attacked from the flank, right? And if these Scots are as many as 10,000, they're levies, of course they find themselves in trouble if they're attacked from the flank. In fact, there's a fierce melee that develops on this relatively open ground as well. Dacre's command lost approximately 160 men, which is fairly a lot for a unit of few thousands, including several taken prisoners as well by the Scots. The Scots lost a number of Home's kinsmen and several Gordon tacksmen. The two forces eventually drew apart and sounded the recall. Right, so there is actually not a full Scottish breakthrough, because seemingly the English cavalry saved the day from the flank. Right, so this has not much to do with Bill's. Home and Huntley's division, 10,000, having lost cohesion after its initial success and now pinned by Dacre's intervention, remained largely inactive for the remainder of the day. The English right under Edmund Howard had been shattered but not entirely destroyed. The Scottish left division had achieved a spectacular local success, at least considering that, again, that the English had been pushed back, but had also in the process neutralized itself and removed a major element of the intended Scottish echelon attack as well. And this happens again because this formation on the far left is outflanked. All right, so this is a very good example of how we'll look now, without being repetitive, how the infantries would have fought themselves there. But this is classic case of combined armed tactics rather than weapons, right? Then the Scottish 2nd Division versus the English centre of the van across the miry Pallinsburn and up the further slope is actually the case where we see more of what fundamentally the Bishop of Durham would have described as the billmen having the upper hand over the pikemen. While the fighting on the English right was still in progress, the Scottish 2nd Division under Earl, Crawford and Monrose, approximately 7,000, descended the steep northern slope of Brankston Hill against the Lord Admiral's centre, approximately 9,000. So you want to appreciate this. This is, yes, the case where the billmen, as we'll see now, and not only them, by the way, there are the longbowmen as well, will essentially manage to take over the Scots, right? But the Scots are actually numerically inferior to their opponents here, right? The English are 9,000 and the Scots are 7,000, and they are advancing, on tough ground and everything, right? So this advance required the Scottish column to enter the miry bottom of the Pallinsburn and then climb a further rise of roughly 200 yards to reach the English line. So they're not even just fighting into the mire. They're actually coming out of that after having crossed. You can't imagine the difficulties there. The soft waterlogged ground destroyed, at least by a degree, because they were still a functional formation, the cohesion and forward momentum essential to a dense pike phalanx. English archers lose their shafts during the approach and then retired behind the billmen. This is at least what we think happened. And so, again, they're advancing under English fire. The English are uphill themselves. So, again, they have the advantage of terrain, of ground. They shower these thickly packed formations with longbows that historically was not really a pretty good medicine, for the people on the other side. Once contact was made on the rising ground beyond the burn, the shorter English bills, this is at least what Durham says, we're talking approximately, as Easton says, 8 feet combining point, cutting blade, and rear spike, proving markedly more maneuverable than the 18-foot Scottish pikes. By the way, consider these were the longest. There was the longest Swiss mounted pike. Then most Scotsmen would have had shorter pikes, also because they literally didn't have the level of training for that pikes where this was not even a pike square per se, right? We don't know, again, how specifically the troops were distributed, but there is just a part of the wall that is significantly trained in any kind of modern sense. And again, you also have to fit the front of the line. They have to be functional to to a push, and just some men of the first ranks in that case would have been trained like that. And so that's where Ruth Hall's observation that the Bills shortly disappointed the Scots of their long spears applies directly to this phase, at least if we want to imagine it, because again, it's a statement made for the wall battle, not for this specific engagement. However, the Scots are in numerical inferiority, on inferior ground, and whatever, so they're showered by the English. We're not told, we do know, as we will see in part, that the Scots did have their own missile element, and they also used them locally to good use. But we're not told about the overall battle that the Scots had any particular missile fire capacity. This is also normal, say, from battle accounts. Like, we're not told all the time, I don't know, what the missile was doing from the other side. Normally, nobody really cared about missile to begin with. But, and so the Scots also here are mostly described by, not entirely, but also by, this is not an overwhelmingly documented battle, but right, it's mostly from the English side. So the Scots are the barbarians, they're this horde, right? So there is less about their perspective to begin with, right? And so we can also imagine at this point, especially the front ranks of the Scots, it would have been pretty heavily armored, would have been men-at-arms themselves, noblemen, and so on. They would have cast aside their pikes at a point and drew swords. The swords, however, were outreached by the Bills and would have proven, in a way, far less effective. But we're told, actually, we'll see it later. I will save the quotes for the end, because they're relatively random, or at least sort of generic, but still precise, at least about the use of weapons. Double-handed swordsmen from the Scottish side did actually fight well against the English billmen, because these were billmen. There would have been also spearmen, there would have been other type of troops, by the way. The English were not all billmen either, right? Prevalently so. But if we assume that that was the average, again, a Scottish man-at-arms with a double-handed sword would have sort of been particularly complicated to cope with by the billmen as well. Right, that's a circumstance in which definitely you can create problems to the billman, even with a tendentially shorter weapon. Sometimes, like, a double-handed sword could be as long as a bill, but tendentially pole arms were longer. Now, the fighting that followed on this rising ground was prolonged and bitter, by the way. That's yet the other thing you want to appreciate. Apparently, the Scots did not actually lose cohesion straight away because of the ground, because of the pike, whatever, or the enemy weapon. So if people keep on fighting, it's because their formation works, right? If everything gets unhinged, like, they break and flee, right? And this happens, if anything, only after a prolonged fight. We're told that all three Scottish earls, in large part of their affinity, including no fewer than 87 members of the Hay kindred, were killed. English numerical superiority in this sector steadily reinforced by organized survivors filtering across from Edmund Howard's broken wing of 3,000 gradually told. This is yet another very interesting circumstance, that we realize that here the defeated sections of the Scottish line were broken, were overwhelmed by elements of the former English forces. And it is true that, indeed, if you count on the formation of pikemen, it's more complicated if you're a spent army or broken one to recompose and go at war. With billmen, it's somehow easier. But this is also relatively sort of irrelevant if those units have completely lost cohesion, right? If anything, they have a greater maneuverability, they can arrive from a greater direction, but we're told for this battle that that's what actually happened. So the Scots kept receiving these enemies from the flanks as well. And again, we're told that the left, the Scots did not do this. The left sit ducks, even though they had won against the English. Probably they had also had this agreement with the guys in the front not to prolong the fight because they were exhausted or whatever, or they were just levies, whatever. So in the end, there's also this Scottish 2nd Division of 7,000 broke and fled under greater English numbers, with, again, all the possible odds against them. So if this is the worst that happened on the battlefield, doesn't seem that the bills beat the pikes. We're not even technically told. Again, the bishop talks in general, and this would have applied also on the other sections of the line, but there isn't like the proof, the 100% where this is what happened, right? Then you have this other phase, the Scottish centre division versus the English main body that has been arriving again across the mire and up the slope with later pressure from the English centre, right? So at roughly the same time, the larger Scottish formation, that is the centre division under the same King James IV, approximately, let's remember, it's 15,000 men. This is really the bulk of the Scottish force advanced against the Earl of Surrey's main body. There was approximately 5,000. So this was 3-1. Like as we've seen with the English right against the Scottish left, it was literally 1 to more than 3. Right? This is 3-1. But at the same time, the terrain is a bit difficult. So there is some leveling mitigating factor. Right? James had armed himself, as we said, with a pike and taken his place in the front rank, consistent with contemporary Swiss practice, but not only, of officers charging with their men to sustain morale. Yet, in the case of the Scots, here we see, as we've seen also about the English from the other side, of course, these guys are habituated to fight on foot in Britain. Right? This is a thing from a couple of centuries by now, so it's not even a Swiss thing. It has not much to do with the pikes per se, but indeed the king himself fights in a pike formation. And of course, it would have been seen as a way to overwhelm the opponent with a push of that pike kind. Right? So there is definitely some, given that here it's also infantry against infantry. So overall, yes, if you want to push away other infantry and you want to fight with a pike, you can do it. Historically, pikes had not sort of advanced before the Swiss reforms because they didn't have the training, but also because they normally faced cavalry. Here there is no cavalry in a meaningful sort of divisional sense. We've seen these reserves that attack from the flanks at the extremes of the formation, but you're fighting against other infantry, so you're going at them. You can't easily, at that point, taking them on. It's difficult, admittedly, for levies, the majority, again, of the Scottish force, including in the king's division, to maintain cohesion. So let's not underestimate this factor that I think is also one of the most important ones overall regarding the quality of the Scottish army. Like one of the single most important one. In fact, this fatal attack stalled, right? The great column suffered losses to English artillery and archery. This is an important aspect. It's combined arm tactics. You have longbowmen and guns and proper artillery that is firing on you as you're advancing. Pretty massive formation. And they're being shot at as they're coming down, right, on the steep descent as well. That would have made it difficult for the Scots also to maintain formation further. In fact, it seems that they, especially the Highlanders at some point, they unshoed themselves to have a better grasp on the slippery, humid ground. Something that the Scots historically, like in the Celtic fringe, were practical in some ways. Now, after crossing the Pellinsburn, it was the division was obliged to climb the same further slope of some 200 yards. And a fort that took the edge from its charge as well. So the same thing that we've seen for the previous division. Surrey's men, 5,000, were pushed back because they were, again, inferior in number. Not even at this point 3-1, because at least there is a mitigating factor, as we've seen. The English are actually on the higher ground. The Scots are disordered. They've taken hits from the longbowmen. They've taken hits from the guns. Yet, eventually, these pikemen are still intact enough to push the English back. One characteristic of this is, however, that the English do not scatter. Right? They're withdrawing. We do not know how this technically happened. Obviously, they were losing cohesion, but they do not completely break. Right? So we actually see these Scots pushing, and this is actually yet another interesting aspect of the story, that when you have infantry fighting against one another, normally you don't have like a crushing element like cavalry that has to push and break, right, in the moment, right? You don't have here flank attacks as we've seen before on the English right against the Scottish left. So infantry is more malleable, and it is true, by the way, that billmen would have been more allowing for some kind of more elastic withdrawal from the ground, but still, this is far from, again, what we said before, that the pikemen would have broken cohesion and billmen fell upon them. Right? We actually don't see this here. We see actually the Scots pushing the English billmen back, right, with their pikes. In the ensuing melee on the rising ground, the English would have surely been fighting in this close combat with bills, but still not solving the matter per se, right? So there is also a source that claims that, but it's a later poem that I think is not very attached to the battle, that that the Scots literally abandoned their, I mean, it's not attached, I mean, it's not very close to it, etc. It may be just an artistic license. So the Scots abandoned at some point. We're not told whether this is exactly the instance, but that the Scots abandoned their pikes for the swords and other lighter weapons, right? And this is an interesting information, right? Showing that evidently, yes, they were getting disordered and that pike was not so effective as we thought. But the battle, the combat in the center lasted some 2 hours. And it was among the most savage of the entire day. So this is actually the point where, in theory, like the bills should have simply overwhelmed the pikemen. But this is not seemingly, as we will see now, what practically happens, nor we're told by anyone that this is what technically happened with precision or absolute term. Again, the Bishop of Durham states that perfectly fine. We states that in general the bills had taken over the pikes, right, as troops, not as weapons. But this is vague. This is not applied to a specific phase, or it's just a general remark, right? In this ferocious battle, Lords Maxwell and Harris fell early. On the English side, Sir John Gower and Sir Richard Hardbottle were among the dead, which shows, by the way, that noblemen from both sides had the capacity and weapons to beat the hell out of and kill each other without much of a problem. Bothwell's reserve, approximately 5,000, was committed late and ineptly, right, crowding into the rear of James's already engaged center division of 15,000 rather than striking any open flank. This is very interesting, and admittedly also complicated to do with such large units, right? It would have probably been difficult to do even for the English. Like, how do you actually outflank? Like, we don't know how much space there was in the flanks, but it's a pretty complicated maneuver even for a non-pike formation, as a matter of fact. So these guys kept pouring in, which evidently was happening even without, in fact, caring too much about the pikes per se. And they had other weapons to begin with too. And at this point, English archers, especially the ones that obviously the archers did not come to group with the enemy, so they could, some would have been wounded, etc., by also enemy archers, whatever. But the English had more archery, as far as we understand. And now, freed from other targets, because as you've seen, the Scottish left that has not engaged, an entire division has been broken. There is, at least for this lighter, broken order missile troops to actually, and this is actually what you would really like to hear also about the 100 Years' War, because this is what the actual role of the longbowman and any other missile trooper in Europe was, that they could close on the enemy flanks and start shooting at them at point blank range, a pretty close distance, right? This is the actual effectiveness of missile troops, not this sort of heavy machine gun longbowmen that cut down heavy cavalry. It never existed, right? I'm sort of exaggerating for the sake, but there are people who think that that's how it went. Like, still, if you search on YouTube for videos of, say, the Battle of Crécy, of Azincourt, never mind any other battle, because there's only this ones, right? Never mind at Poitiers that there were more Gascons than English band, that they also had crossbow. That's it. But it's always like you have, even in, I don't know, Peter Dennis, I think, made an illustration for us, but there is literally like the image of archers that are killing knights charging against them and effectively terminating their charge. So it's something insane. Like the fact that we still have this kind of ideas that have been completely debunked by any evidence available, is primary sources, any kind of historiographical approach to the saying, does not say anything. You see how easy, even in a video like this, how easy it is to generate myths, right? If I search for the Battle of Flodden online and I incur in Scholagladiatoria's video, this says, why did Bills beat Pikes at the Battle of Flodden? And there are going to be, and this is the general advice I also make to match it, don't, right? I understand that say you can do whatever you want, and say that this is not a matter of public concern in a burst, but let's say the idea that there are going to be people that are surely going to leave, of your 500,000 subscribers, you're going to leave your channel hearing that the Bills beat the Pikes at Flodden, and we don't actually have, even through the Bishop of Durham, a valid objective way to reasonably think that that's what actually happened in the battle. It's really a problem, right? If we have the capacity to look at this better, let's look at this better, right? This is not, again, yes, it's criticism towards Matt Eason's work, but it's not like of the kind of, oh my God, your work sucks or whatever. It's not the case, but I wouldn't otherwise criticize you. Like, it would be, funny at some point to do stuff to some other channel. But of course, I also think that it's important for me to make video responses for channels that more people look at, and that in fact find this where you can find this important issues, right? It's not, again, I don't want to use the term misconception, it's just a mistake, but it's truly something can be adjusted. And I'm sort of showing how it can be done. We will talk about this better also in the end if we have some time, right? And so, again, this is not a good situation, because you have here apparently almost 20,000 Scots, but you have in the front more Englishmen. They are coming at you from the side, this difficult terrain, and this is actually the clash that seems more difficult to build. But say, as we'll see now, there are forces that arrive from the from the flank, right? But elements of the Lord Admiral's successful center. Remember, these have beaten the Scots. It's numerical superiority. There are other 9,000. So you have here, we start becoming the same size at least of the same King's division. And this fight is prolonged. Again, it's on difficult terrain. Scottish reserves have difficulties on it to enter the fight, right? Whereas the English have also more flank maneuverability here. Not because they had billmen per se. That's partially true, but the most important thing is because they had battle lines that could arrive, they could inject other troops. It will explain better, make it more concise in the end, right? So, especially Lord Admirals, that is also the commander here, having disposed of the 2nd Division of the Scots, later added pressure against the Scottish flank. In all of this, which is also yet another elephant in the room, and this massive, savannah kind of, elephants roaming around, James himself was killed within a spear's length of Surrey's banner, right? His left hand, which means, again, that they had also been fighting after all this time, getting properly to commander versus commander. So whatever had happened here, it's not a brawl where, the Scots are being beaten because, they're fighting with pikes and the English have the billmen, so, or they had better. No, this was a conventional fight that doesn't go out for hours like this. Of course, the Bill had to do with his death, at least that's what we think. In fact, his left hand was nearly severed, which a Bill can definitely do. His lower jaw was pierced by an arrow, interestingly enough, and his throat was cut which again, like this can have happened also in different ways. You never know what happens during combat or after that, because sometimes there are also post-mortem or even some torturous ways of killing people. In any case, we will never know what actually happened there. But people say, oh, these are almost certainly the work of a bill. Well, yeah, it may be the case, but how does this explain, in any case, the battle? Like, this is another story. Around the king lay the bodies of the Archbishop of St. Andrews. By the way, it was his natural son. This is the flowers of Scottish lay and ecclesiastical princes, Bothwell, Cassilis, Morton, and many others. Only as dusk approached did the remaining Scots of the Centre Division begin to respond to calls to abandon the fight. Right, so it's not even like the entire thing breaks down in a complete way. This is an incredibly massive battle in which we see that the English actually suffered pretty concrete losses against evidently functional Scottish formations. And we have to assume from this that, because what happens here is also general cascade, also further Scottish losses along the way, that the Scots had fought virtually all as pikemen. So while the English inflicted losses also in the pursuit, okay, but with what? Like with the bills, all right, but also with archers, with cavalry weapons, with guns, with artillery proper. Like here, the Scots would have done, they had a bit of this themselves, but we're not told. So quantitatively speaking, this also counts virtually for what were the actual proportions, right? So the Scots were actually a pretty mighty host, and one that did inflict the English some important losses, right? The English didn't have the highest, the most positive rosy odds here, right? This all can be explained even without the kind of weapons that they were using per se. We will again explain this better. And there is this last phase that is involving the Scottish extreme right division versus the English extreme left on the northeastern slopes approach via dead ground and gully. In fact, on the extreme Scottish right, the Highlanders under Argyll and Lennox, approximately 5,000, together with Dussy's French cadre. And so we have to assume that the French also had the pikemen, and the Swiss drilled ones here, rather, had remained unengaged throughout the earlier phases. So again, these pikes, the French connection, whatever, are we sure that the pikes that we saw fighting there were just merely a product of the Swiss drill? And that therefore the bill would have beaten this Renaissance or proto-Renaissance pike experiment of the Scots based on the continental model. This is also the general skepticism that I have, that I don't see here bills beating pikes per se. I really don't. All right, this is just heavy infantry going at one another, and basically they have difficulties due to terrain. They are more or less advantaged by what's happening on the various parts of the line. They can send in reserves. They have enough space, room for doing so, or they have enough will to continue the fight. They have enough training to actually go on. This is what seems to me that the battle really tells us. Sir Edward Stanley, having at least reached the field by a circuitous route, this was the guy, again, that had gotten lost because they had no guides, right? This happens in the north. After the loss of guides, between 3,500 and 5,000 men used the cover of rain, mist, and dead ground to approach unseen. He exploited a natural gully on the northeastern face of Pace Hill near Piper's Hill to bring his division onto the Highlanders' flank and rear. A commanded party was first sent forward to feint against the front, while the main body divided into 3 battalions under Sir William Molyneux, Sir Thomas Gerard, and Sir Henry Kiley struck the unprotected side and rear. So these guys are effectively outflanked, right? Because the enemy comes from an eccentric direction, and the weather is what it is, the terrain is what it is. And so the English, again, chapeau to them, because as you understand here, they made the best use of their forces, right? The Scots really had issues of some kind. English archers delivered a sudden and concentrated arrow storm against relatively unprotected backs as well, because this is the point, especially if they were pikemen. That's what the missile does. Like if you have to pin the enemy. And here they come from a different direction, so the enemy flank is exposed to begin with. And so, as we said before, as also Easton said, if the units were they couldn't deploy in a certain way, they couldn't simply change front if not by maneuvering. Here we're caught by surprise, so it's basically over, right? In fact, the Highlanders of Argyll and Lennox broke their array, colliding in confusion on top of this with elements of both Will's reserve that were still moving or reforming, and in some cases turned to looting their own dead. Right? These are the things that made a battle count. Like the fact that instead of thinking of saving the day, like these people had started to despoil the corpses of their own companions. That's definitely sort of speaking of the level of sort of the general conviction of Scottish forces, their training, their background, whatever. Now, these things admittedly happen pretty often. I mean, the English would have done something similar at some point, but in general, right, this doesn't depose much in your favor if we know of this to begin with. Both earls and several of the principal chiefs, Campbell of Glenorchy, MacLean of Ardamurchan, MacIan of Glencoe, and others were killed while attempting to stem the rout as well. That's actually the only part where the thing gets ugly, and you actually are chased and cut down, and you're also running over your own forces and so on. Stanley's men then turned downhill from the higher ground to add their weight to the fighting, still continuing around the Scottish Centre Division and Surrey's main body. So, again, on top of that, you say, oh my god, how long did it take for these Bills to beat the Pikes? Here you have a typical outflanking maneuver, attacking from the rear because of overabundance at this point. So it's a mopping up operation. But this explains much better what was going on. And this, technically, as we've seen here, it's actually the French, where we think that we're not told exactly where the Swiss drilled infantry was among the Scots, but if we assume that it was closer to the French, this is actually the part that collapses the earliest. So, which means that the quote-unquote traditional, or whatever the Scots had arrived to do with their pikes up to that point, is part of the Scottish host is overrun. It's mostly because they are taken from the rear. Right? We're not told that the billmen destroyed the pikemen in the sense that their formation would have been shattered beyond repair. This is more a myth. Like, this makes you understand why the quote from the Bishop of Durham is somehow a partial and generic statement. It may have looked like that, but it's also maybe a way of saying it doesn't have to be a scientific description of what happened, nor it's meant by the same source to be precisely descriptive or absolutistically descriptive of what happened during the battle. So I wouldn't use it to claim that, again, Bills beat Pikes at the Battle of Flodden. By approximately 7 o'clock, with darkness falling, organized resistance had ceased across the field. Right? Note on Sir Marmaduke Constable's brigade of approximately 2,000 on the left of the English van. The sources are less explicit about its precise actions, but as part of the van, it stood available to support the Lord Admiral's centre or to face any Scottish elements that pushed further east once the main collisions developed. So the English actually had more troops committed than committable in specific sectors than the Scots, paradoxically, right? Due to terrain, to the lack of intervention, to the way the difficulty the reserves had faced in getting to action. So this is very interesting because it shows you, if we especially take into account the overall numbers here, that of course, if you don't even have multiple times greater host than your enemy, the general clash between here, this is an English Scottish force, it's a broader British system, right? They're going to be pretty balanced after all. And so even, oh my God, an army of 40,000, even though I personally doubt, again, that the Scots had something like 40,000. If it had, I don't know, 35,000 or 30,000, I would say, okay, well, it's possible. But again, here, the proof is that even if they had been that numerous, evidently didn't serve for much. So this speaks more of the overall quality of the army than anything else. Actually, the bigger the numbers of the Scots, the less relevant what kind of weapons that they were using. This is strictly sort of collective sense in terms of group dynamics. So here we are. I don't think that there is much to add, right? Whatever the English advantage would have been, even let's admit that the Bills had conferred English with this tremendous advantage, or appreciable one, right? First of all, if it is not tremendous, it's not even decisive. So we shouldn't say that Bills beat Pikes at the Battle of Flodden. But even if we gave that for granted, at least it was this tremendous factor, these English advantages became crushing only after the Scottish columns had already lost their cohesion through the combined effects of artillery and arrow fire, and not even lost their entire cohesion. Actually, they were functional units that went on fighting for hours, right? And they had descended into the miry Palin's burn. They had subsequently climbed up the further slope. They went on fighting, right? In particular, the case of the left division under Home and Huntley, 10,000. You see the self-neutralizing consequences of an initially successful charge against Edmund Howard of 3,000, followed by Dacre's flank intervention of 1,535,000 because of combined arm tactics, rather than, again, they were pushing the English back, right? So this is the point. So I would like to come back to these three final quotes. Like the first one is actually the fuller, modernized version of but still literal version of the Bishop of Durham, right? That is where we get also the general idea of the Scottish armoredness and the fact that we're, again, suffering with the bills that were, again, we said it before, also longer here it says than the swords, as evidently some of these pikemen had abandoned their pikes. It says, the Scots were so well protected by complete armor jacks, almain rivets, splints, almain stands from German, pavises as well, and other equipment that here it's mixed. So as we said before, there would have been, in my opinion, pikemen with pavisement, but say in general. It says that the Scots were also well equipped, right? Equipment that arrow shot did them comparatively little harm, all right? So this also explains the fact that we're still fighting. These accounts sometimes say, oh my God, we're so disordered when they arrived against the English, in part because of terrain as well, but overall they were functional. They hadn't even taken this enormous amount of losses, right? When it came to hand-to-hand fighting with bills and halberds, they were such powerful, large, strong, and big men that they would not fall even when 4 or 5 bills struck one of them at the same time, which, as also Easton observed, is really impressive. But of course, it is understood specifically after, here is said, after, for how heavily armored they had actually been. It said, nevertheless, our bills served them very well, and bills that he just mentioned, by the way. When 4 or 5 bills struck, and did more than the bows, for they quickly deprived the Scots of their long spears, in which they placed their greatest trust. And when the fighting came to close quarters, although the Scots fought hard and bravely with their swords, they could not withstand the bills that struck them so thickly and severely, right? So again, how the Scots were deprived of their long spears through the bills were not actually told, right? Easton thinks that this is because the English were more heavily armored, and in this sense, we've seen that the English took losses among their men-at-arms as well when the pikemen were pushing them back. This reference of the bishop is to the overall battle, right? So it's not really there is more about, this is just a part of the account, right? But overall it talks about the other people who were downed, whatever. So for what happened here, we understand that the general collective training of these forces was sort of enough for make the thing functional. This explanation remains somehow generic. It doesn't refer to one specific part of the battle. It doesn't seem to align to the duration of the combat as well. And it doesn't find comparative elements much elsewhere. Like, it's not saying here, there was more armor than we think about the Battle of Flodden. So again, rereading the whole piece would have been somehow even more effective at the beginning. If you listen to the video, like, you're missing an important point out. I understand that for some reason Ethan was singling this information out, but the whole phrase is so well, we can find this source also relatively easy on archive.org if you don't have other books. But because sometimes it is cited, maybe already sort of with this other elisions, but this is the much of a problem now. There is another source by Pitt Scotty that was born actually like 20 years after the battle, so it's a later source. He was a Calvinist. It doesn't have much of our sympathy. This is very interesting because it even complicates the notion that the Scots were just about pikes, right? It would make the point that basically, for example, double-handed swords were particularly effective against bills, that even though they were longer, and they were also pretty good anti-armor weapons in some ways. But historically, again, let's not open other parentheses, but again, pole arms had always, here double-ended swordsmen had to be properly trained, so we're thinking they were mostly men-at-arms, and here the source is somehow magnifying the Highlanders that, as you know, tended to fight like that. But Highlanders are also often depicted as lacking adequate armor, fighting in this primitive way. It would remain for centuries asleep in the Middle Ages, in the deep older Celtic world, even though they could adapt quite brilliantly also as mercenaries across, for example, the Baltic, Central Europe, whatever. But this is interesting because it shows that there definitely were not just pikes, and there were other types also from the Lochaber axe is some sort of bill, right? Why wouldn't the Scot have those, for example? That's where the bishop's words are somehow Sibylline, because again, it makes you wonder. This is yet the other thing we didn't bring up today is, how many billmen actually exists also from the Scottish side, because it wasn't just about pikemen, right? It would have been some other troops, obviously, and that would have fought as billmen themselves. And so even though we virtually think Scottish armies with that kind of overall array, if you think about it, really, why wouldn't they have something similar from their side? There was literally no reason for which, as we've seen, given the number of pikemen, there wouldn't be in the posterior ranks some troops that would be equipped with that, not for any greater tactical purpose, but just because they would have gone at war like that, and they would go at war like that, as we've seen in our videos about Scottish lowland pikemen for centuries like this. This is quite important to stress as well. Probably, even though we don't have much of an indication from this battle in particular that the Scots were also equipped with a substantial amount of billmen, of bills, we do know that, of course, some traditional Scottish weapons still used in the 16th to 17th century were things like war axes, right? The Lochaber, like, there were different types of pole arms themselves. Here, again, we're not told. We're just being told by Durham that, again, apparently these English bills were super weapons of some sort, but also literally in the passage after, we're told that the Scots had magnificent armor. And it is not said about the English per se, right? Finally, I wanted to talk about that other important source that I was anticipating before regarding the English suffering wounds from the enemy pikemen as well, right? This comes from the Scottish field. This was a Stanley ballad that celebrates the role of the Stanley family and their Cheshire, Lancashire followers in the battle, right? It's thus an English source that says about their own troops, right? It says, they, the Scots, approached us with spears and put many over, that the blood outburst at their broken hardness, right? So approach means thrust or push, pierce, put many over means knocked many down or overthrew them, which, as we've seen, it's exactly what happened. We're still on the English right and Scottish left, right? And so this passage described the first initial Scottish pike charge against the English right wing. The Scots' long spears temporarily broke into the English ranks, causing casualties and forcing some to give ground with blood bursting from damaged armor. Right, we were just told by the other source that there were double-handed swordsmen as well, with bowman support. Here the English say about themselves that the Scottish pikes literally pierced through their own the English armor and causing horrendous wounds, right? Massive bloodletting. So this is also for saying armor from the English side. Is it the missing piece here? I don't actually think that's the case. So this is my general understanding of this battle. I don't see it as a triumph of the bill over the pike. I just see a battle in which one host had prevalently bills in their heavy infantry and the other had prevalently pikes in their heavy infantry. We don't even know how many Scottish axemen, billmen existed from the other side. They were, again, we're talking British armies, they were the same. We're talking the early 16th century. Like how much do you think these hosts, especially such large ones, really different from one another, right? This is my take on it, right? I think the sources are fairly clear. There are other primary accounts of the battle from which we can reconstruct everything we said today, but if we have to look at the effectiveness of the bill over the pike, we're just told in apocalyptic terms by the Bishop of Durham that basically the English disarmed the Scots with their pikes, that had to pass to the swords and were beaten by the bills once again. Which sounds a bit of a sort of optimistic, positivistic, mechanistic, not even rationalistic statement, right? So overall, the battle seems to have instead unfolded on the basis of the gradual attack of the various divisions, this combined armed tactics, the important use of cavalry and infantry, the capacity of the English to inject the reserves more effectively into the fray, the Scots having difficulties because of terrain, but we're not told, for example, this is what you understand here, is that we're not told really that the Scots had these tremendous problems crossing terrain. We observed that, but the idea that the formation would have been broken by that terrain is not consistent with the fact that it went on fighting for such a long time as well, right? And we realized that the matter was split as the English managed in three distinct sections to outflank the Scots, which may be a problem again because they were pikemen. But say had this happened with the Scottish pikes against the English rear, it would have been the same, right? Or with the cavalry, it would have been the same. So this also doesn't specifically speak of any particular weakness of the pikemen per se. So the overall criticism of Easton is say overall, say mechanistically plausible as far as individual abstract formations are concerned, but as far as what we're told about the battle, other than this weapon versus weapon that Durham somehow refers to, there is actually no bigger picture coherently telling us, look, this went this way because these guys were using bills and the others were using pikes, on the basis of how battle formations work. Battle formations went the way they went. It's mostly an outflanking fest in a pretty messy battle, as we can probably think. Lots of dead from both sides. So again, we don't talk even about the aftermath or anything. This was just to provide with that explanation as far as what scholagladiatoria provided us with. I would like also to point out that Matt Easton did actually make a video about the Battle of Flodden, where he talks profusely about the whole situation. He actually, at some point, I think, says something like that the bill, it's a victory of the bill over the pike is, quote, his own words, complete rubbish. He talks about more or less everything that we covered here. It may have gone more in depth here and there because it's just a 40 minutes video of his, and he has an introduction about the war of the League of Cambrai and sort of the various raids that led up to the battle, right? So more or less, he knows the battle, right? This is also he talks about the whole thing, the terrain of the decision to leave the high ground, the failure of the Scottish artillery, loss of pike cohesion in the mire, the continuing importance of English archers, and relative army conditioned professionalism. So I'm not going to comment on that because it's an old video, it's from 3 years ago. But I presume that Easton actually knows much more than what, for example, he seems to be suggesting in this video. And so again, in this video, the thing he actually, the video about the other day, what he goes the harder on, or at least he somehow points out as something that apparently was never pointed out, is the relevance of armor in this, because it's instrumental for him to say that basically you could go against pikes in a more successful way, right? So there are all these relative debates one can have online. I'm personally very grateful to Matt Easton for these videos because they allow more debate on the subject, right? When I was searching this on YouTube today, for example, I realized that nobody really had, aside from the bigger channels that I think terrible maps and that, just overly stressing how disordered the Scots were, etc. Like just conceptually, right? Those scatter boxes, even if they had, as they did, get disordered by the terrain, whatever, 15, 20 minutes trying to explain that simply is maybe, okay, who's going to remember even that, right? So these are the question marks that sometimes I pose myself, because I see no coverage on this stuff in general, and so much good work could be made by YouTubers in general. And Matt Easton is kind of the only person that is bringing these topics up in a world where, again, literally so many people could, but historians, general educators, like if they have the sources, they can make 2 + 2, they can't somehow at least have a debate about this. But there isn't much of this online. So that's why scholagladiatoria is great. And I sort of came up with this version that is pretty much aligned with scholarship. There is nothing innovative about it. I just, again, think that regardless of the importance of the bills, including this particular context against the pike, which is, I think, the same identical conclusion that Easton reached in the video that he made about the battle 3 years ago, this is not much even of a... We're not even sure that if it hadn't been for the Bishop of Durham today, we wouldn't even be talking about the victory of the bill over the pike. It would have not been conceptualized as such, right? You see how much in history we owe to one line, the sort of general reflection on a broader picture that wasn't necessarily there, that were we to explain with the most conventional indicators, we would essentially think, oh, well, but this is kind of pretty much a normal battle, right? How we think two heavy infantries of the time would have gone at one another, really. However, in general, I stop it here for today. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.